Mary said to the angel, "But how can this come about, since I am a virgin?" "The Holy Spirit will come upon you," the angel answered, "and the power of the Most High will cover you with its shadow. So the child will be holy and will be called Son of God. I am the handmaid of the Lord," said Mary. "Let what you have said be done to me." And the angel left her. That's the great fiat of Mary. Let it be done. Fiat. Let it be done to me according to your word. That's the assent that we give to the truth. You don't argue with the truth. You can deny it, I suppose. You can run away from it. But ultimately, we have to just give our assent, consent to the truth. Can't argue that 2 and 2 equals 4 at that level. That's what it is. And so each of these episodes of the very familiar nativity story no doubt have a historical connection to events in time. We can never discover or recover those historical exact connections. There's a place in Nazareth, I suppose, where the house of Mary, and there's actually a little plaque on the ground which says "Et verbum caro factum est." This was the place where Mary was standing when the angel spoke to her, and the shadow of God covered her. Oh, it's very wonderful to believe that. And you can believe it and not believe it at the same time. So we don't know exactly where it happened or what lies behind that quite mature theological passage. The Nativity story was the last part of the Gospel to be written. So it contains the longest and deepest theological reflection upon the meaning of Jesus and the experience of the early Christian church. So we can't expect to recover the exact historical information that lies behind these passages, which means also that the real meaning, the real sense of this story is mystical. What does that mean? It means that it relates to events that take place within us. They connect and describe for us a process of our own spiritual evolution and coming to spiritual maturity, coming to spiritual knowledge. The connection between that mystical truth, mystical revelation, mystical teaching, and the world we live in is a very important one. It's, of course, a connection that doesn't seem very real or very conscious to most people today. We divide them. We have our rituals for Christmas, as we have for other seasons. They are largely secularized, of course, have a very tenuous link with the religious tradition that generated these rituals and symbols, like gift-giving and carols and so on. Christmas, for that reason, is for most people just a time of nostalgia. We're not actually looking into the real meaning of these symbols and of the story. In fact, most people don't even hear the story repeated. But we look back nostalgically just in our own life to our early memories of Christmas. I was listening to the radio as I was driving yesterday, and it was a rather funny man, I think it was on Radio London, who was saying how he hated Christmas. And he hated all the fake happiness, and he was quite funny in his, I suppose, melancholia or his dystopia. But he had seen something also about the fact that the way we celebrate Christmas, what we try to get out of it, the kind of feelings, emotions, mood, atmosphere that we like to generate around Christmas is largely nostalgia. But that's because we've lost the connection with the mystical meaning. If we could reconnect with the mystical meaning, it would be a much more powerful time of reflection. I mean, we have time off. We usually use that time off being very busy about shopping or cooking or running around, but we have time off work. We could use that time, for deeper reflection upon the meaning of our life and the meaning of the world around us. So that's what we're going to do briefly today in the time we've taken. A few weeks ago, when I was in Latin America, I was giving a talk one evening, I think it was in Paraguay, on meditation and violence, and I called it the reduction of violence, because it seemed more realistic to speak about reducing violence than just suddenly ending it and condemning all violence, and condemning it isn't going to make it go away. So I tried to reflect on how a contemplative consciousness that's developed and strengthened by regular meditation can give us insights into where this cycle of violence comes from, to recognize its origins and its patterns, and the contemplative mind will be able to intervene at an early stage, or even at a late stage, and try to reverse that cycle of violence, which of course is a recurrent one in human history. And that requires a change of perception, a raising of awareness, as well as highly developed political skills to deal with people with conflicting interests and people who have polarized for many generations, people who hate each other, even the sight or the name of each other. It isn't enough just to say, sit down and meditate, and it isn't enough just to say, we could do better than this, because violence is an abandonment of the rational, in fact, and it is also a loss, as one great Northern Ireland poet said, violence is the failure of the imagination. We can't imagine any other way of responding and reacting except to descend into the cycle of violence. So it needs a change of perception. It also, of course, needs skill and discipline. But we also need to be able to see that violence is a corruption of the human. If the human is an icon of God, and there is no violence in God, only mercy and justice united in love, the impossible combination of mercy and justice becomes real, tangible in love. If that's true, then when human beings become violent, it's because we've forgotten or we have rejected or distrusted our own true nature. We've really forgotten who we are as human beings. And in that state of forgetfulness, that low level of consciousness that violence is, even though your senses may, of course, in a violent situation, your senses are very alert and awakened, and your adrenaline is running, and your fear and flight mode is on full performance. Nevertheless, in terms of full consciousness, we're at a very low level of human consciousness. And in that state, though, we bring the highest gifts of humanity to work on what is inhuman. And violence is the most inhuman of activities. And we create monsters like nuclear weapons, or anti-Semitism, or genocide, or homophobia, or any kind of scapegoating, any kind of projection of hatred and blame onto another group. And sometimes, of course, we justify these monsters in the name of a monstrous God that we have created as well, in the image of our own lower selves, a very egotistical God of our overactive imagination. This violence is not only physical and military, it can also occur in forms of corruption, in social economies, in politics, in business, through the whole body of society. It's another form of violence. And of course, if you're born into that world of violence and corruption, you will very quickly, as a child, be conformed to it. You will learn in Northern Ireland that the Protestants or the Catholics are these hostile and stereotypified opposites, opposite from you. So how do we respond to this rather unpleasant world, which is a world that is actually described in the Nativity story? If we understand the mystical meaning of this story, then we'll see that it's not about a happy, nostalgic recalling of a beautiful, idyllic time. It's actually a representation of life as it is, even at its worst. So how do we respond? How do we reduce this infection of the human mind? Seeds will always be there, of course. We can never, in this world, have a lasting peace. The peace of Christ is not peace as the world gives it. Peace as the world gives it is temporary, ceasefire, contingent. But it's that peace of Christ that arises from the contemplative consciousness that drives all our work for peace, even that peace in the world, the peace that the world can give. Well, I think what we could say is that the cure, if there's one cure for this virus, it is the cure of attention. It's the ability to see things as they truly are. Simone Weil said that there are moments in human encounters where we encounter human suffering that all we can do and the most compassionate thing we can do is simply to pay attention. We can't solve the problem, but we can pay attention. I was talking to some doctors the other day who are learning to meditate, and one of them was talking to the group and said, as you know, most of the problems we deal with are insoluble. Most of the illnesses we have to cope with, you either don't know what really is the matter. Most of them will go away on their own if you do nothing. And most of them we can't actually solve anyway. It's nice on the occasions that you can fix something and make people feel better, but most of the time that isn't the case. Which only goes to prove how important it is that in the healing art of the doctor, of the nurse, this quality of attention is at full performance. I mean, how ridiculous to be distracted from the person that you are treating, even though by focusing upon the computer screen or simply the test results, and not see the person or respond to the person who is actually the person about whom these test results are drawn. So that quality of attention is a healing force. Maybe you can't solve the problem, but you can certainly make the person feel better. So it's the same, this is what Simone Weil was saying, and I think this is true not only at the interpersonal level, but the cure for the violence that we have has entered into the human cycle of life is attention. Contemplation is attention. Attention purifies all our ways of perception. And what we do is, of course, decided by what we see. What we see, how we understand something, how we perceive it, is going to shape what we do. So anyway, I was talking about this and thinking already about the Christmas story, actually. And then at the end of the session, we got news of the attacks in Paris. It was exactly at that time, as I was speaking, that these attacks in Paris a few weeks ago were taking place. So it brought home to me quite powerfully the question of what is the relationship, what is the meaning between of contemplation and contemplative practice. What is the purpose or the meaning of meditation in a world with those kind of problems? Is meditation an escape or an encounter? Again, if we look at the Christmas story, that very familiar story, I think we can see how much it is actually an encounter with the reality of the human condition in its entirety, with its shadow side, rather than an idealization of it or a kind of religious escape from it. We escape sometimes from our encounter with reality by taking refuge in, not in God, but in religious language, and pious religious language. So, what about this story then? Well, we can see just how real it is when we look at it. Where does it begin? Particularly in Gospels of Matthew and Luke. and our received version of the story is a combination of these two Gospels. It's not the same story in all the Gospels, because the Gospels were written for different audiences at different times by different people. So it begins, of course, with this disturbing and embarrassing note of social disapproval. So Mary has said yes, but as a young unmarried girl, she has now become pregnant. And most of us here can remember a time in our society when, illegitimacy was a big shame and slur on the family honor. Still is in many cultures. Often leads to violence or the killing of the girl. So this is actually where the story begins, with Mary having suspicion cast upon her, and Joseph, of course, being a good man, decides he just send her away somewhere to some even smaller suburb of Nazareth and keep her out of sight. And then, of course, we know the angel comes in and says, "No, you don't have to worry. This is God's work." But that's that's the opening of the story. The shadow of disapproval, the shadow of social exclusion, which is very disturbing, eerie feeling of the fear of rejection by your own society. We all want to be at least respectable, at least approved of, at least feel that we belong. And one of our probably deepest primeval fears would be of being thrown out of the tribe, thrown out of the village. So this is the beginning of the story. We're put in touch with this deep fear within our psyche, the fear of being alone, being excluded. And this is the shadow cast by the light of God entering the womb of Mary, entering into her being and conceiving the Word of God, the Word made flesh. And so we see this strange reality that in the real world, or in the world as it is, when the light enters, it also casts a shadow. And it meets anything that resists it, doesn't understand it. He came into this world and his own did not recognize him, his own rejected him. So we rejoice in the light bursting in to the human and transfiguring the human this way. But we also live with the shadow that is cast by that light. And then the second, that's in Matthew, of course, but then in Luke, the next main detail of the story is, which situates it historically in this big census that was taking place by the Roman Empire, the big bureaucracy. There's no historical record of that census, but we don't quite know what it may refer to, but it certainly seems to symbolize how the Mary and Joseph were, like all of us, caught up in a social machinery, bureaucracy, state bigger than ourselves. We all feel its impact on us at certain times. It protects us, but it can also pressurize us, it can also destroy us, of course. So anyway, Jesus is born into this bureaucratic world, which makes people go off and be counted in the census. And then the next famous detail of it is that there was no room for them at the inn. And so they had to, so Jesus was born in a manger. Lots of footnotes about what the manger meant, but the meaning of the story is surely clear, identifying Jesus, the birth of Jesus, with, again, that aspect of human experience that is most fearful to us. 70% of the population of Syria are displaced, 70%. 40%, I think, in the country, 30% outside of the country. So they know what it is to have no room at the inn and have their home destroyed. They're in something, I don't know, some of you may have been here in London during the war and during the Blitz, and anyway, we've all seen pictures of it. And stories of people going home and finding their home wasn't there. Seen pictures of, Syrian cities after they had been liberated, and there's actually nothing there. They look like Berlin or Dresden after the bombings. So, again, this little detail of the story connects its meaning to a deeply painful and fearful aspect of human life, which is our fear of homelessness, our fear of not having a place, not having stability. When St. Benedict wrote his rule for monks and created these little communities, it was in the middle of an age of terrorism or barbarism, and the civilized world was crumbling. Institutions, Roman law and justice and education were crumbling around them, and good government was being undermined, and the barbarian forces were just moving in and wreaking havoc. So he created these little islands of stability where civilized values could be lived, values of community, of sharing, of balance, and of respecting the needs of the human person, both in terms of food and drink and shelter and clothing, all of which he has chapters written about, and also our need for education, for intellectual nourishment and stimulation. And that's where our modern ideas of education began. And then also, of course, for him, the whole thing held together by a spiritual vision, a spiritual purpose. The times of prayer integrated into the schedule were what held the whole thing together. So, quite understandably, perhaps these little pockets of these oases of stability and peace and civilized behavior became very powerful and very popular. So they became, a home that was not only a refuge, but a home that was a place of cultivation, a place of growth, a place where he also always said that the monastery in that form was only a training camp. It was only a place to begin the journey of human development and spiritual maturity, after which you would then be able to, come to, he says, the single-handed combat of the desert, which means you're prepared to be yourself, to find your own work, to find your own integrity, whether that was in the community or elsewhere, he doesn't say, but the purpose of this home, like the purpose of a family, is for people to mature and find themselves and then do what they've got to do. So, without a home, without some stable structure, without a family, whether it's a biological family or a spiritual family, we can't really develop that maturity. Human infants at birth are among all mammals are the most vulnerable. It takes years, it only takes minutes for a newborn cow or a horse to begin to look after itself. It's on its feet, and then it sort of hangs around its mother for a while, I suppose, but pretty quickly it's on its own. It takes us years, longer and longer, probably 35 years or so. And but we need this these connections, the stability, these traditions, and of course these are very much under pressure in our society. The institution of the family, we know how fragile and how vulnerable they are today, and so we look for other ways of creating the networks, the communities, the sense of belonging, the sense of friendship, the sense of acceptance, that feeling we have of coming home. Somebody said to me the other day that it was meditation that gave them this feeling of home for the first time. And it was very insightful, because he said, I would go long periods, he was talking over a long period of time, he said, I would give up meditation, just drift away from it, too busy, too distracted, doing two other things. And then I would remember it, and I would know that I wanted to come back to it, so I would start meditating again, and I had this sense of coming home. And it was a really good insight into what home really means, not only the physical or the psychological aspect, which of course are necessary, these structures of physical and houses and places and psychological relationships that make a home, but really the home is our heart. Now, that's maybe cold comfort to those Syrians who have seen their homes destroyed. But we're also teaching meditation in some places to refugees through refugee services. And I suspect that their very terrible experience of homelessness maybe, at least in some of them, does awaken this deeper wisdom of what the home is. So even if you don't have a home, there is your heart. I'm not saying that's the substitute for it, but it is maybe one of the consequences of it. So, and when you come home, it is only home if you feel accepted. It's not just the house, the familiar rooms, the familiar food on the table. It's not only home because it's familiar of the family, but it's home if you are feeling accepted by the people there. And there would be little point, in a way, I suppose there would be some, but little point in taking refuge in your home if you didn't have that feeling of acceptance by the family that you belonged to, that you were part of. So anyway, maybe all of this is touched on by that little detail of the story, that there is no room for them at the inn. The homelessness of the human condition. And then, again in Luke, who always has a option for the poor in his mind, the way Luke writes the story, he seems to be tuned more than the others, evangelists, especially to the plight of the poor and the needs of the poor, the marginal. And so not surprisingly, perhaps, the good news is first communicated to the shepherds, tending their flocks. Again, a very beautiful, familiar nativity school nativity play kind of element, you know. It's amazing how we communicate these very deep and sometimes dark truths in these very childlike, nostalgic, sentimental, cute ways, you know. But actually, they're carrying pretty heavy messages. Maybe that's why we have to wrap them up in pink wrapping paper. So, what do the shepherds represent? Well, these are the lowest of the low. These are people who are ritually impure. I'm not quite sure why they should have been ritually impure, but they were regarded as that. And so I suppose it'd be like saying, I don't know, the Queen. Well, I suppose that maybe, I don't know, Prince William, the news of his child, of a birth of his child, is first given to the street cleaners of London. They're called together, and not the Lord Chief Justice or Home Secretary, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the hierarchy of the nation, but the street cleaners or the toilet cleaners. Probably toilet cleaners might be that's one. I always feel very sympathetic with toilet cleaners. So these are the people who get the message, the first news, breaking news, CNN, breaking news to the shepherds. And they get it, and they come and they see. So the good news of this event, and it is good news, it's just good news breaking in to the bad news. But the bad news isn't suddenly sent away. It's the good news of the birth of Jesus coming into all of the problems of the human condition. And then in Matthew, we go back to Matthew. We sort of build up this sequence of these events, but putting the two Gospels together. So it's a construction. So Matthew, the next, of course, big detail is the three wise kings. So these are representatives of the wisdom of humanity, as it was seen at the time. Wisdom were not scientists. Probably today if they were writing the story, it would be nuclear scientists or cutting-edge biologists coming to worship the newborn king. But for them, wisdom were these kings, astrologers, from the east. And so they find their way, they follow the star, calculations, and they arrive, they go to see Herod, and Herod, of course, is the consummate politician. He's only interested in what does this mean to me, and how does this affect my politics and my survival and my power. So he easily fools them and tells them to tell him as soon as they find out where this Messiah is born, then he should let him know so that he can come and do homage as well. That's not why he wants to come. So again, the story is embedded in the reality of the murkiness, the messiness, the immorality, the egotism of politics, the power systems of the world. So anyway, the three wise men come and they do homage and they give their gifts. And this is again a wonderful, exotic and beautiful moment in the story, full of symbolism, but also one that reminds us of the context in which this good news is happening, this birth is taking place, this coming into the world. And then Joseph gets another dream and says, you better get out of the country straight away because Herod is after you. And this is then the most horrific part of the story, the massacre of the innocents. That's something out of the Holocaust. That Herod goes, sends orders for all male children under the age of 2 to be killed. And a voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and loudly lamenting. It was Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they were no more. So, I don't want to spoil your Christmas, but this is the story, actually, that we are celebrating, retelling, learning from, and trying to understand again this year as in previous years. It's not a depressing story, but it's not depressing not because it's an idealized, nostalgic picture of some kind of, romanticized childhood happiness. I mean, we become nostalgic about it and we idealize it because we project back into our own childhood. And we think we were perfectly happy, and we probably did have wonderful, blissful moments in our early Christmases. I hope. Sure we did. I certainly remember them. I mean, you actually can't contain yourself because of the excitement and the bliss of it at times. So we project back to those memories, and we connect the Christmas story to those personal, autobiographical memories. But that's not the story, actually. That's our story. And it's our story that has not yet been invaded by the story itself. It's when our story has been fully thrown open to the story that is there, that is given to us. It's then that the meaning becomes truly, amazingly positive. good news, not just second-rate nostalgia, but first-rate hope. That because it fully encounters all the problems that we face. So then they become refugees, the Holy Family. They have to go to Egypt, not a friendly country either, but they end up going to Egypt. And it's only some time, we don't know how long, after that when Herod dies, that they feel safe enough to come back. So think of all those people who escaped from Eastern Europe when the communists came. And I've met people who went back 30 years later, and it's not easy to go back. But anyway, they go back and they settle in Nazareth, and then finally they settle down to normal family life. It's only then that anything that we could identify with as a idyllic, there he grew up, he grew in stature and in favor with God and people, and it was there that he lived under the authority of Mary and Joseph, as the Gospel tells us. So there we have the feeling of finally they've got a stable family. And then we don't hear anymore. That's the news bulletins stop for the next 25 years until suddenly Jesus appears along with John the Baptist, and the story picks up again. So how does this speak to us? I think it speaks to us through the most universal, simple, primary human experience of birth. The first thing that happens is that we are born. So this is a human birth, but it's occurring in a world that is just as divided, as violent, as unstable, as dark, as at times horrific as the one we're living in. So we can certainly identify with this. Things haven't changed that much. All of these elements, exclusion, homelessness, violence, refugee crisis, they're all there for us. The good news is that in this over-familiar world, this particular birth has happened. And it's a birth that represents, or that manifests a connection to the source of all being, to the origin of all things, the word through which all things came to be, becoming flesh. And as John's Gospel says, most people didn't get this, and very few people still do. Such a extraordinary claim to make. And it is a physical, actual claim or statement. It's not a symbolic statement. It's actually clearly there's a lot of symbolism in this, but the symbolism is pointing to a physical reality, to an actual event, to an individual birth, to an individual child who became a particular adult human being. So in all of this, all of these aspects of the real world, as we still know it, the incarnation of the eternal Word happens in the midst of human turbulence and the cycle of violence. And if we focus on that meaning of the significance of this particular birth, because it gives us a new perspective, an entirely new perspective on those familiar and recurrent problems of our self-destructive behavior. Because from this perspective of the birth of the Word of God, God becoming human, Word made flesh, Jesus as the exact and complete translation of God into the human, without losing any of the connotations or any of the meaning of God, fully into the human. Then in that perspective, we understand that these problems of humanity, this dark and shadowy side of humanity, we understand how much they are self-destructive behavior. Psychologically, we enter into self-destructive behavior when our coping mechanisms have been overwhelmed, when we sabotage ourselves because we're frightened of failure, because we lack self-confidence. How could anyone love me? Therefore, we set up our own isolation and rejection. Or we punish ourselves, or as young people often do, harm themselves, or commit social suicide, take on repellent habits that are designed to push other people away. So all of this self-destructive behavior at an individual psychological level is scaled up and projected onto social and collective and intertribal levels of human life, into war, into genocide, into the mindlessly self-destructive behavior such as we see in Syria at the moment. And the rest of the world, when that happens in particular places, the rest of the world looks back and looks at it with astonishment. How could they do this? Well, we've all done it at certain stages in civil wars, in our own history, or in the Second World War in Europe. So it's from this dark and mysterious place of self-destruction and into that the light of the Word comes. And if it weren't able to encounter this dark reality, then the story of Christmas would simply be, nostalgia and consumerism. And we wouldn't have to have a Christmas preparation day, because we could just enjoy a few days of self-indulgence and a few days off work. But it's precisely because this story addresses and engages with those parts of the human story and the human condition which are most painful and most shameful. It's precisely because of that we celebrate Christmas with joy and with an irrepressible hope. So after lunch, I'd like to speak a little bit more about the mystical aspect of it, and also how this work of meditation that we're doing, and the work of silence that it involves, how that engages with this understanding. I'd like to end listening to this psalm, and then we'll take a few minutes of meditation before we go for lunch. So this is Psalm 46, and this is the one where we have the great meditator's verse, "Be still and know that I am God." But we often take that verse out of context. And just listen to the context in which this verse, "Be still and know that I am God," be still and know, okay. The context in which this verse is born in this psalm. And it's a context very similar to the context I was describing for the story of the Nativity. God is our shelter, our strength, ever ready to help in time of trouble. So we shall not be afraid when the earth gives way, when mountains tumble into the depths of the sea, and its waters roar and settle and seethe, the mountains tottering as it heaves. There is a river whose streams refresh the city of God, and it sanctifies the dwelling of the Most High. God is inside the city, she can never fall. At crack of dawn, God helps her. To the roaring of nations and tottering of kingdoms, when he shouts, the world disintegrates. Come, think of God's marvels, the astounding things he has done in the world. All over the world he puts an end to wars. He breaks the bow. He snaps the spear. He gives shields to the flames. Be still and know that I am God. Exalted among the nations, exalted over the earth. So this being and this stillness and the knowledge of God that arises from this stillness is not occurring in some idyllic, peaceful cloister. It's occurring in the midst of the roaring of nations and the tottering of kingdoms. It emerges in the midst of violence, organized violence, in the armaments industry, the producing of bows and spears, bows and arrows. And this is the marvel. This is God's marvel. The astounding thing he has done in the world. All over the world he puts an end to wars. He breaks the bow. He snaps the spear. He gives shields to the flames. Be still and know that I am God.